What's going on, you guys, and welcome back to the channel, where today we are going to be circling back very briefly to the Psycho franchise as we review Bates Motel. Now, I'm not talking about the TV series, but rather the made-for-TV movie from 1987 of the same name. Um, I don't really know how well known that this movie is supposed to be or anything like that, considering even the back of the DVD case makes mention of how this film is the rarest within the Psycho legacy. And perhaps for good reason. Uh, this is meant to be a direct sequel to Hitchcock's 1960 film. So everything that we got from Psycho 2 onward, just erase it from memory. Men in Black it, scratch it, doesn't matter here. Um, and I went into it with a pretty open mind and a lot of generalized positivity towards it because despite all of its shortcomings that I just assume are going to be a part of a made-for-TV movie, what I read in terms of a synopsis was quite intriguing to me. This is a story where Norman Bates passes away. He never makes it out of the sanitarium. And his roommate, Alex West, upon his release, essentially inherits the Bates Motel as part of Norman's last wishes. So this concept of having somebody that is as mentally disturbed, if not more so, than Norman inheriting the Bates Motel and kind of everything that goes along with it in terms of its grim and grisly history, had the potential to be decent. Now, what I will say about it is I found it quite bold to make a Psycho movie that doesn't directly revolve around the Bateses. So kudos for that, whatever that's worth. But the vibes of this movie from the very beginning are just way off base. The movie opens, it hits you with the title card, Bates Motel, to this scene of the sun rising up over the Bates house to very warm, cozy, unthreatening music that was similar in feeling to something that you would experience in like a Hallmark movie or something like that. I genuinely thought for a split second I was watching the wrong movie. It then goes forward to explain that Norman's roommate actually started out as like a 10-year-old kid who experienced very similar traumas in parental abuses at a young age. So the doctors, thought it best to kind of stick them together and for lack of a better word, allow Norman to raise this kid. Now, to a certain degree, I understand it, right? They're birds of a feather, they're kindred spirits, they've gone through a lot of the same things, and this kid needs a friend. But it struck me a little bit odd that, with how mentally deranged that we know Norman is and has the potential to be, that they would give Norman access to this kid that has, psychological issues of his own. Um, it also strikes me a little bit, or struck me a little bit odd because it goes into showing pictures to kind of, explain their relationship. There's pictures of um, them at like a birthday party. There's a picture of them at like a parade or some kind of protest or something like that. There's pictures of them outdoors, like climbing trees and such. And, again, to a certain degree, I can understand it because they would want to give this kid those type of freedoms and those type of experiences. They don't want to lock him up for the rest of his life so that he just doesn't ever experience what it's like to be outside again or anything like that. But I was of the understanding that Norman Bates is extremely dangerous, and that this was when we last left him at the end of the Hitchcock film, this was like a high security psych ward type situation. So it struck me again as very odd that they would just allow him to have these types of freedoms and such. Now, like I said, they are just pictures, so we don't really get to know the context in which they were taken. But I should have known from this point forward that we were in for a bit of trouble. Um, the early plot of this movie is set up very similarly to what we got in Psycho 2, where Alex has been released from the asylum. He has been seen fit to rejoin society and everything like that. But the townsfolk and everybody around him that knows, anything about Norman Bates and where Alex comes from are kind of expecting him to regress, to to crack and to fail. Um, and I can believe that they were trying to set him up as this very doe-eyed kid that doesn't really know any better. Maybe he doesn't know the exact truth when it comes to Norman, you know, based around the fact of how, closely bonded they were and everything like that. Certainly, he's somebody that might not know, what he's getting into entirely with the motel itself. Um, but the issue here is he is so likable, almost to an irritating degree. He's got this childlike innocence to him, this naivety to him, and not quite in the way that Norman did. With Norman, he had these qualities, but there was always something about him, his body language or the way he would look at somebody. Something would tip you off to make you feel um, that something was off about him. There was always this kind of darkness or this sinister energy kind of lurking underneath it. And with Alex, he's just genuinely a likable guy who just he genuinely loves Norman and wants to resurrect the Bates Motel and make Norman proud and succeed. And he's a tough guy to root against. Add that to the fact that any real sense of tension or suspense or I guess horror that this movie has is immediately diffused by some sort of comic relief. So those things together just create a very odd experience when it comes to um, what is supposed to be a psycho film or based in that universe. Um, it does change a little bit of the lore, which is an entirely uncommon when we look at, every installment of the Psycho franchise. But here, I took some notes so I would remember. They changed Norma's name to Gloria, which was kind of weird. Um, and then they say that her body was never found initially, which is probably the biggest flaw. I felt like, because obviously the biggest thing about the original Psycho film is that Norman refused to bury her, and so he kept her in the the basement or the cellar. That's a well known fact. That's a huge part of the story, the grand reveal of the movie. Um, and in this film, in particular, she is discovered while they're doing dirt work as part of the renovations to the hotel. They uncover her casket and whatever. So she's been buried in the front yard, but immediately upon finding her, the sheriff says that, with all the chaos and hysterics surrounding Norman's arrest and everything like that, nobody knew what happened to his mother. She was never found. They do change the story a little bit um, with what happened to Norman's dad. In the original story, I didn't really pay that close of attention, or I didn't really remember. But the internet says that in the original story, he was stung by bees and killed that way. And then I remember in Psycho 2 and 3, it kind of goes into the idea that Norman's aunt is the one that killed him for, whatever reason. And then I get the impression that they obviously retconned that in the fourth one to go back to he was just killed by bees, because they erased everything to do with the weirdness with his aunt and the who's Norman's real mother thing. And in here, they basically insinuate that Norman's dad is an absolute dog who spends way too much time at the motel, if you know what I mean, and he essentially just disappears. He leaves. But then, shortly after they discover uh, Gloria's body, they find his, which it's insinuated that uh, I think Norman's mom must have killed him and buried him. I don't know. They kind of hint at it, but they don't really land on it directly. Um, and then towards the end of the movie, there's this really strange subplot where uh, they have the grand opening of the Bates Motel, or the grand reopening. And this woman shows up She books a room um, with the intention of ending her life. Um, she's been married 4 times with no kids and just generally is unhappy. So she intends on closing the chapter on herself, so to speak. Around the same time, this huge group of like 50s kids that are having an after prom party at the motel show up. And something to keep in mind is that Alex talks to them, he interacts with them, he tells them to be quiet at one point. And during their dance and everything, he's in there serving them punch and sandwiches and just kind of doing the customer service thing that you would expect. But then the movie um, goes on to explain that all of these kids are ghosts of people that have um, committed suicide at random points um, 30 years ago. And initially I had thought maybe they represent uh, this huge group of people that have bad things happen to them when staying at the hotel. But no, they just kind of randomly show up as you know people that have done the same thing that this lady is trying to do, uh, by way of trying to convince her not to do it and to show her that there's more to her life that she needs to appreciate and to not to continue living, which is great, but there's zero connection to to the motel, and I really don't know what this has to do with the movie overall. Um, but perhaps the weirdest thing about it is, like I said, Alex can see them, he can talk to them, he interacts with them, he acknowledges them as though they're actually there, which kind of put me in the mind of like, okay, maybe he is just a titch psychotic. Like maybe this is them kind of nodding to like maybe he's not entirely fixed. He's seeing ghosts. But the character nor the movie in general really acknowledges this. Like, you know, it it shows him very clearly interacting with them, tells you that they are ghosts and they're not really there, and then they just leave, and the movie ends in this very uplifting, wholesome manner. I don't know. This movie. Uh, I guess if you're a Psycho fan, or you go into this thinking that it's going to be what you would expect from this franchise, this ain't it. This is not a Psycho film. This isn't even a horror film. I don't really know what this is. I can only imagine that, they had the idea and they showed it on NBC, and maybe they didn't want it to be overly scary or intense because it was distributed to what I would assume to be a larger audience and stuff like that. But and I guess it's a movie that's more family orientated with a positive message that you can watch with your kids or whatever, because there's nothing really scary or brutal that happens. It just ends on a very, very positive note. But like I said, this isn't really a psycho film in the traditional sense, really any sense at all. So I guess, you know, is that a positive thing? Is that a negative? I don't know, but it kind of wore me out a little bit. Um, but yeah, I think that's going to wrap this review up, guys. I know I got a little bit long and rambly here, but until next time, as always, thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves, and we will catch you in the next one.